Welcome back to the Raven LeBeau podcast. On today's episode, we're going to dive into issues with my narcissistic ex and how he was when other people were around. So grab your favorite drink, snack, and enjoy the show. So let's start off with after meeting the family and friends, what we discussed about him not feeling comfortable being out in public with a trans girl. To say that that kind of hurt me was an understatement because he told me that he wanted a relationship with a trans woman like me and that, he was ready for that and all that it entailed. But when I got here, I found out that he wasn't ready for all of that. So let's just say that it hurt me deeply to know that my partner was ashamed to be seen with me in public. So, as we go into this episode is going to be mainly about his friends and uh, us meeting and talking and getting to know each other. So, he had five friends, two girls and three guys. Um, we would later meet up and we would go for drinks and we would talk. But the first meeting that we had in public with his friends was with Mark and Jesse and Bob. We were going to a soccer game, and it was the first sporting event that I had ever been to before. And I was really excited about it. I'm not a big sports person, I'll be honest. But I do like to go to the games with my partner if that's what they're into. And I like to, yell at the players and stuff like that. So we went into the city to meet his friends for the game. We met at a pub before the game started and had some drinks and some bar food. If you know what that is, it's basically just fried stuff. So we had that, and his friends were really interested in me and getting to know me. So they started conversations with me, started asking me questions, about my life, before I moved here. And I was kind of nervous to talk to them. I mean, we did have the party, the barbecue thing where we all met, for the first time. But, he kind of controlled that situation, and I kind of just sat back and didn't really do much, as of getting to know them. And so we were sitting there, we were drinking, and after I have a couple of drinks, people call me a cheap date because I get drunk kind of fast. So I'd had two drinks, and I was feeling talkative, feeling bubbly. My personality was coming out, happy go lucky, bubbly. And Jesse started talking to me about, moving out here and what it was like for me. And so I was talking to her and I was answering her questions, and everything. And she then asked me about transitioning and about how, all my surgeries went and everything. And I had to take a step back for a second and think really hard, was this something that he'd already told them, that I'd already had my surgeries when in fact I hadn't? Trying to make me someone that I wasn't just yet. So I was kind of confused a little, kind of threw me back. So I didn't say anything, and I was like, oh, well, I haven't actually had my surgeries. I'm in the process of, speaking to my doctor about it, getting the paperwork done. And he immediately cut me off and started a whole different conversation about, times that they had spent together, him and his friends, in the past and all this, trying to kind of cut off what I was saying as if he didn't want them to know the actual truth. So I was like, okay, I just sat there, and I was, sipping on my second drink, and I was just like, okay, I didn't know what to do. So I just sat there and didn't say anything until Jessie turned to me and smiled, and then she asked me another question, about, how things were going since I got here. And I told her, I had found a job, that, it wasn't paying a lot, but then I was looking for another job that would pay more. And she's like, oh, okay, you'll find something, it's not that bad, and everything. I said, yeah, where I work now, it's not bad. It just doesn't pay enough, and I have to pay half the bills, and I can't really afford to. And then again, he cuts me off because he doesn't want them to know that I'm having to pay more than I make in bills that he could easily cover on his own. because, he wanted to look like this good person that he painted for them. So he continuously cut me off every time I was asked questions, about me, about my life, and he would change the subject to about himself and to about his job, and his side hustles, and how he was doing work in, the city, and all this. And I'm just sitting here like, am I not supposed to say anything? Am I just supposed to, go along with everything he's saying? So then Mark had asked him a question about, when he came to see me, in where I was from, when he came to see me there. And he went into, tell the story and everything. And I'm just looking at him like, that's not how it happened. I was like, that's not anything like how it happened. But I didn't say anything, I didn't cut him off. I let him, tell his story, and everything. And I'm just sitting there like, that's not it at all. So then, Bob, he's just sitting there and, in and out of the conversation from time to time, and, drinking his drink and, bullshitting with the bartender sometimes, not really, asking me any questions, not really talking to me, and I was nervous, so I wasn't really talking to him either. So, he looks, at the clock on the back of the wall at the bar, and he said, "Oh, the game's gonna start. We need to get making our way down there." So, we paid for the drinks and everything, and he pulled my bar stool out, helped me up, let me put my arm in his as we walked out the door, very gentlemanly like. And I came to realize, that he liked to show off in front of his friends because who he was in front of his friends was not at all what I got on a daily basis at all. So we're walking down to the match, and I'm wearing, a nice little outfit with heels. I had on jeans, a jersey, a sports jersey, heels, and everything. And we're walking. And there were a couple of times that, when you're in heels and it's uneven, you're going to, kind of sway and stuff. And he kind of pulled me, which made me lose my balance, and I'm just like, okay, just go along with me. Don't pull against me, And he gave me this look like, don't tell me what to do kind of thing, but he didn't say anything. And I just, went along and, we walked and we got to the stadium and we went inside and come to find out our seats are like all the way up in the nosebleed section. So I had a lot of stairs to walk in these hills and the stairs are really like narrow, small stairs. So walking up them is very hard in heels. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know how to walk that far up. And then we're into the row a little bit. So when you go in, it's very narrow in the row as you're going through. So I'm in heels trying to navigate all this without falling. And, I almost fell a couple times, but, I caught myself, I'm pretty good in my heels. But, I got seated in the seat and everything. And Jesse was sitting next to me and my ex was on the other side of me. And I was just like, okay, I'm good. I'm sitting here, I'm watching the game. And, Jesse talked to me, was trying to talk to me a little bit, but then he, tried to get my attention away from her because I guess he didn't want me to say something that I shouldn't say, So then she just turned and watched the game and we were watching the game. And then he was on his phone taking pictures. I was taking pictures and videos of the game. He was taking pictures of the videos in the game. And I was just like, okay, maybe, you know, this is going to be an okay day, and I sat there and I yelled at the players on the field. I was getting into it for the first time I'd ever been to a sports event. I was getting into it. So I was like, okay, this is fun. This is interesting, you know, and I turned to look at him. This is about maybe an hour into the game. I thought he was, taking pictures and everything. I turned to look over at him, and he is actually on his phone texting and scrolling through porn. And there are people around us, okay? There are people around us that can see over your shoulder. You know how a stadium is set up. And I'm just like kind of embarrassed, that he would be looking at that stuff with people around him, but he was the type of person who didn't care about any of that. He didn't care if people saw him looking at something because then he would get attention for it. So I just simply nudged him. I said, can you not do that while we're here? Can we just enjoy the game? And he gave me this look like, go to hell. And I was just like, okay. So I just immediately just turned back to watch the game and everything. And then I noticed that Jessie was looking at me and I just looked over at her and I smiled and she was like, oh, smiled back at me like everything was okay. So we left before the game was over. And it was, our home team was losing, and they weren't playing the best, so everybody wanted to just go to another bar and get drinks and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, cool. I kind of wanted to see the whole game, but, I was like, okay, I'm just going to go along with it. I'm not going to make any waves. So we went back, to another bar down the street and we got more drinks. I didn't get any drinks because I was already buzzing. I had two and that was enough for me. So he's getting his, drinks and everybody else is getting drinks. And I just ordered, some bar food and a regular soda. And everybody's, talking about the game, how bad, the team was playing. And I'm just sitting there, just like a lump on the log, just not saying anything or doing anything. And um, Mark turns to me and he's like, "Oh, you know, he told us that, you moved out here, and that you had found a job and that you're looking for another job." And I was like, "Yeah, this job doesn't pay a lot of money, and I'm trying to be able to, to help out where I can, and be able to afford things, so I'm trying to find another job." And he was like, "Oh, there's, plenty of jobs, in this and this and this and this field." And I was like, "Okay," and I, took his advice and, put resumes out and stuff like that, through LinkedIn and all, the other sites that you can go on. But, he was talking to me about different, types of jobs, stuff like that. And because the conversation wasn't about my ex or he wasn't the center of attention, he had to like immediately get in there and be like, "Oh yeah, she's doing good. She's got a good job, she's looking for another job." He just had to go in and then as he's talking to them, the conversation goes back to him and about his side jobs that he's working on and how, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And then we're going to be able to do this. We're going to be able to travel, like they travel, because Jesse and Mark, they travel a lot, and he wanted a relationship with someone that he could travel and build memories like they had. And I was like, okay, I get that, but in all reality, you don't show that on a daily basis. It's like we work, come home, half the time I'm getting silent treatment, like I did something wrong when I haven't done anything wrong. I'm like, I don't know where we're gonna, find time to travel when you keep saying we don't have enough money to do anything with, and I'm just like, okay, he's painting this rosy picture, this nice picture of us and what we're going to do. And in all reality, it's not like that. So I didn't say anything. I just sat there, eating my mozzarella sticks and, sipping on my soda. And I didn't say anything. And Jessie looked over and she could see that, I was kind of distant and not really into the conversation. So she, again, wanted to talk to me about my transitioning and, hormones and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, yeah, I started telling her about, I'd been on hormones for, a good 10 years, and I only had a little bit of development, no curves, no, no nothing from the hormones really, just, a little bit of the soft skin, a little bit of, breast tissue, but not a lot, and he's looking out the corner of his eye at what I'm talking about. And I'm just like, here we go. He's going to cut me off again, and as soon as I got into the point of where I was in the process of getting everything set up to do surgeries, he cut me off again. And at this point, I just shut down completely. I got on my phone and just started, surfing through social media and, just trying to keep myself, occupied while his conversation was going on about, how happy he is with me and how we're going to do these things and how he's going to help me with my transition and everything. And needless to say, I wasn't allowed to talk about my transition, but he was allowed to talk about it in the way that he wanted to. So we finished up our drinks, everybody was ready to go. We said our goodbyes. I got a hug from Mark and from Jesse and Bob. I just gave him a handshake, didn't really talk to him much. So, we walk out, we walk down to the car, he's holding my hand and everything. And again, he's kind of pulling on me, making me uneven in my heels, which I told him not to do before, but he continued to do it. And I pulled away from his hand, so I wouldn't fall and wouldn't feel awkward, in my heels. And he gave me this look of like, what the fuck are you doing? And I'm just like, you know what? I just walked to the car and, he opened the door. I got in, he closed the door, he said goodbye to his friends, and he got in the car. So we are driving home. And on the drive home, it's kind of quiet. Didn't say anything, not much, it's just like I'm looking out the window. He's on his phone texting while driving, as always, is one of his things. And I didn't care who he was texting. I didn't care, what he was doing. And he turned to me and he said, "What's the matter? Why are you so quiet?" And I'm like, "It takes two to talk, and you're over there on your phone scrolling and texting, which I've asked you not to do while you're driving, because it's unsafe." And he's just like, "Oh, well, I know how to drive, and I can text and drive, I'm good. And I'm just like, I'm not going to argue with you. And he was like, "Well, we had a really good time today, didn't we?" And I was like, "You had a good time. I had a miserable time. You cut me off at every, turn. And I knew this was going to start a fight. I knew it. And I don't know why I said it, but I did." And that's when it started. He was like, "What do you mean? I didn't do anything. You were having conversations with them. You were having fun with them. There's just certain things you shouldn't be telling them. There's certain things that you shouldn't tell my friends." And I'm just like, what's the point of me meeting your friends and trying to be friends with your friends if I can't have an honest conversation when they're asking me questions? That's all I asked. And he blew up and he started yelling. And I was just like, you know what? I'm done. I turned, I looked out the window. I was scrolling through my phone. And then, as soon as he noticed that I wasn't giving him attention, I wasn't feeding into the argument, I was just sitting there, um, his attitude kind of changed a little and he wasn't yelling. He was just like, "Well, it's just they're my friends, and I feel like, we should, have boundaries and respect." And I said, I didn't do anything disrespectful. I said, I'm tired, the game and everything. I'm still a little hungover. I was like, I'm just gonna, sit here and, just look at some videos on my phone and, and we can just drive home. So he then turned the music on that he wanted to listen to and, turned it up and just we drove in silence the rest of the way home. So we get home and, I'm going about the normal stuff, I'm taking off, my clothes, my makeup, my hair, all that stuff. And he comes up to me in the bathroom behind me and, he starts like kissing the back of my neck and, trying to make nice. And I was like, I don't want to be in a fight, so I'll just make nice. So we started talking a little bit and he's like, never a sorry out of his mouth. He's just like, it's just we need to, not talk about certain issues, and we need to not talk about, certain things that have to do with your transitioning. And I just looked at him and I was like, okay, if you say so, and he was like smiling. Then he was happy because, I wasn't trying to argue with him. I was just giving him what he wanted. So I was like, okay. Um, I just I just completely shut down being happy. I completely shut down being who I was, and I just, went into the bedroom, turned on the TV, and then he came in and he's like starting, to fill me up, trying to get, sex initiated. And I was like, I really don't want to do this. I really am not in the mood for sex, but, I didn't say any of that. I let him do what he wanted to do with my body. I just laid there because I knew I wasn't going to get anything out of it anyway. So he was getting busy, he put me on my knees, on all fours like he always did, and he turned on the camera to record a little bit, and then after about maybe I would say 5 minutes of recording him, having sex with me, he went soft, he went limp. And I was like, okay, I didn't say anything, because when a man has that issue, you don't say anything because you don't want to make him feel embarrassed or anything. Even though I was really pissed, I wasn't going to do that to him. And, you know, he just turned, on porn and started rubbing against me, and started rubbing himself. And then in a few minutes, he was still holding his phone watching the porn, and then he entered me again. And I was just like, okay, he needs porn just to have sex, okay, you know, and um, I didn't want to say nothing, I just wanted it to be over. So I just put my face in the pillows and waited till he was done. And then, I got up, went and got cleaned off, got me some snacks, got in the bed, started watching TV, having my snacks. Then I, threw the stuff away and I laid down on my side and was looking at YouTube on my phone. And he snuggled up behind me and he was like, I had a great day with you. You look very sexy. And all this niceness after he treated me like I didn't even really matter most of the time, cutting me off. I couldn't really talk to people. And it was just like a 360, and I was like, what the fuck is going on here? So I just wrote it off as, that's just who he is. And I didn't like it, but I learned to live with it. I learned to maneuver around it so that the minefields wouldn't always go off. And I constantly had to walk on eggshells, and it was not fun. And I thought meeting the friends was going to be really fun. I was going to be able to be myself. Unfortunately, myself was not something he wanted me to be. So his other couple, he had two couple friends. So his other couple friend wanted to go out, I think the following weekend or maybe the weekend after. So it was Claire and Leon, and they had been married for a while. And, he had always told me that he wanted a marriage like theirs, a happy marriage, a long marriage with someone. And I was like, okay, that's nice and everything. But I don't see marriage for us, with the way things are going, and we're only, not even a year in. And I'm like, I, I don't know. And so Claire had reached out and said, why don't we do breakfast on Saturday morning? And, he said, okay, yeah, we could do a breakfast on Saturday, and they made all the plans. I didn't know anything about it. I just knew that I was off of work that Saturday and it would be okay, and it wouldn't interfere with anything. So I got, ready, I put on a nice little skirt, I put on heels, a nice little top, a little blouse, and my garter belt, my stockings, looking really nice. Like I like to look. Did my makeup, did my hair, and, got ready. We walked out of the house. He held the door open for me. Then he opened the car, helped me in, being a real gentleman, and I was happy, and we were in a good place, and we drove down to where we were meeting them at, and we got there, and we went in, and we sat down, looked over the menu. Claire, she started talking and asking questions, but he was kind of focused on the menu, so he wasn't paying her any attention. And her husband Leon was looking at the menu, and I just simply said, "Oh yeah, like you do when your partner is not really invested in the conversation. You just kind of fill in." So I just like, "Oh yeah, he did. He came and he saw me in New York." She said, "Oh yeah, he told me about that," and then she went on to tell me what he had told her. And I was like, okay, that's halfway true. I said, but I'm not gonna say nothing. He's telling his friends the version that he wants to tell them, not the real version. I was like, okay, so I'm not gonna say anything. And I just said, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. And he just looked up from the menu and smiled at me like I had said something correctly, like I should, get a treat. And I'm just like, okay, let's go along with this. Don't be yourself today. And so I was like, okay, so Claire was talking to me, about her job, and how, she had her own company, and how she worked, and what she did. And I told her, I had a job, wasn't making much money, I was trying to pay my half of the bills. And she said, your half of the bills, doesn't he make more money than you? Can't he pay more than half? And that's when he kind of cut her off and changed the subject real quick, to his side hustle and how he was going to be working, in this city, and he was going to be doing this and that. And the conversation kind of just devolved into him and his side jobs, and him asking them if there was anything that they needed to be done, on their property and stuff like that, because they owned their own home. So I'm just sitting there, not saying a word, just looking. And then the waitress comes over, we order our food and everything. And that's when, him and Leon were talking about, work and, other stuff. And Claire turns to me, she says, he told us that you're trans, and he told us that, he wanted to be with a trans woman. She's like, I don't know, anything about that, and, she's like, what is it exactly, and I was just like, well, it's basically, that I felt all my life that there was something different about me and I wasn't really sure what it was. I thought, I was gay for a very long time. And then, I realized that it wasn't that. I still didn't feel comfortable being gay. And I went into my story. And as I was going into my story, telling her that, my doctor and I discussed transitioning into a female, which felt right for me, I got cut off. He kind of took over the conversation and was telling her, yeah, she's transitioning, she's talking to her doctors, she's getting everything moving much faster here than she did there, and I'm so happy for her, I'm so proud of her. But yeah, I couldn't tell my own story. Why I couldn't tell my own story even to this set of friends, I don't understand. It's my story, it's my life. I should be able to tell it as it's supposed to be told, not the rosy version, the one that he liked everyone to know. Because there was a lot of ups and downs during my transitioning that, I had to go through, that I didn't have any support for, that I didn't have anyone I could talk to about. And it was very difficult for me because I would try to talk to him about it, and it was just like, oh, well, it'll happen. It'll get done. It'll happen. You don't got to worry about it. It's going to happen. I've seen it. I've manifested it. It's going to happen. But that's not the point. The point was that I needed someone to talk to about it because it was weighing on me. But that's the kind of person that he was. And instead of telling his friends the actual truth of how hard it is, how difficult it is, he sugarcoated it. He rose colored it. And they all bought into it because he's this nice guy. He pulls my chair out. He opens the door for me. He walks holding my hand. It all looks good on the outside. And so, she's eating it up. She's, going along with it and everything. And I'm just sitting there looking at them like, okay, I'm not saying another word. So I finished my food and I was quiet the rest of the time. And she gave me this look like, something's wrong or whatnot. And I didn't say anything. I was just eating my food, ignoring the whole conversation basically. And so we were all eating at one point, and he was on his phone again, texting someone, scrolling through, his little sites that he's on. And I saw that out of the corner of my eye, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start a fight. So we all finished, and we were talking a little bit. Well, they were talking, and I was just listening and, nodding my head, like a good girl, waiting for my treat. um, you know, I was a good girl, you know. So I just sat there and just kind of let the conversation go where it was going without me included. And once, the check had came and the bill was paid, he was like, oh, we got to run because, we got things we got to do. And, we've got errands to run and we've got to, go do this and that. He's like, he wanted to go. And they wanted to go to like a bar and get a drink, but he wanted to go. And so I was like, okay, so she was like, you know what, we should exchange numbers. And he was like, oh, no, I'll give you her number later. Don't worry about it. And I'm just like, I can't even give my number to her, What, you're afraid we're going to talk about something we shouldn't talk about, which was going through my mind. I was like, okay, whatever. And I was like, yeah, he'll give you my number. Yeah, he'll give it to you. And then, he opened the door, helped me in the car. Then he got in the car and, we drove off. And he was like, oh, it was nice today. It was a good conversation. You didn't overshare. And I was like, yeah, I was a good little girl. And he was like, yes, you were. He's like, you were very good. He's like, I'm going to give you something good when you get home. I was like, yeah, I know what it is. It's a bone, right? So I was just like, okay, I just smiled my best, smile. and just went along with it, let him be happy because I was used to being miserable around him. I was used to being ignored. I was used to being made to feel this big. Um, so we sat in the car. We talked a little. Well, he talked. I listened, and I would interject a yes or a no or oh yeah, that's good kind of thing. But not really anything more than that. And so we're listening to music. Mostly of what he wants to listen to. Of course, he didn't care what I wanted to listen to. So it was like whatever he wanted. And so we drove. He talked. I listened. And we got home, and I opened the door and got out, and then he was like, "Well, why did you open the door? I was gonna come open it for you." I was like, "It's okay, I got it. It's no big deal. I know, it's exhausting to be a gentleman 24/7." And he gave me this look like I'd said something wrong, and I was like, "Oh crap, here we go." And he's like, "Well, I enjoy being a gentleman, and it doesn't matter. Next time, just let me open the door." I was like, "Okay, fine. I'll wait for you to open the door." And we went into the house, and we were, cleaning up, putting stuff away, and everything. And then I'm in the kitchen, putting the dishes into the dishwasher and stuff. And he comes up behind me. He's got no clothes on, and he just starts filling me up, and I'm just like, okay, here we go. Here's my reward. And I'm just like, okay. So, he takes me into the bedroom, and, there was very little to no foreplay, maybe a little bit of, nipple play, and that was about it. And then he went and turned me around and put me on all fours like he always liked to do. He did that, and we were having fun, or he was having fun. I was just taking it because I was getting nothing out of it. He wasn't even touching my body. It was like it was a whole show for him. And I was just like, okay. And then he went soft again. And I was like, okay. And then he just like laid down next to me, and he's like, I don't know what's going on. He's like, I don't get this. This don't normally happen. I was like, this is not the first time this has happened. I'm like, he's like, well, it's probably because my mind is somewhere else, and I can't focus. I'm like, yeah, that's probably it. I was like, why don't you just put on some porn and we can finish up? And he was like, "Oh, I'm not gonna need porn. I'll just, rub on you a little bit, and we'll be good to go." So, he's like, "Well, why don't you get down here and rub on me and, give me some head?" And I was like, "Sure, why not?" So I went down there, got him going and everything, and he was ready to go again. And he put me on my back for the first time in a long time, and put my legs over my head, and he was looking at me, and I was starting to feel, like we were connecting a little. So I started to enjoy it a little. And then he closed his eyes and kind of went into his own little world and didn't look at me again, and just kind of, I don't know, it was just like motion. It was just like he was doing this thing, not looking at me, not touching me. His hands were by his side, and I'm just laying there, with my legs up, like, the hell? So he finished off, and that was it, clean up, go get some dinner, and then go and run some errands, that we had to do before bed. And we didn't even actually do the errands. We just went for a walk, which was nice because, I liked going for a walk. It was nice and relaxing. I didn't have to talk, and he didn't talk. We had our headphones on. We would walk, hold hands sometimes. It was nice. So we went for a walk. I was relaxed, came home and took a shower, was getting ready to go to bed. And he was like, you know, you looked very pretty today. I was very proud of you for, not oversharing. And I was like, what am I, some freaking dog? That every time I'm do something right, I get praised. Every time I do something wrong, I get the silent treatment for days until I apologize for something that I didn't even do wrong. I was like, what is this that's happening? So I didn't understand it at the time. I wouldn't understand it till later, on. But at the time, I was just confused. I was thrown off balance at how one moment he was nice and sweet and romantic, and the next moment he was vicious, mean, cutting me off, making snide remarks, and then saying, "Oh, I'm just teasing. I'm not saying anything to be hurtful," but it was hurtful and it wasn't teasing. But I would laugh it off like it was just teasing, because I was walking on eggshells, like I said. I was trying to keep the peace in the house because I hate to argue. I hate to fight. So I would come to learn throughout the years that we were together that this would start to become the normal and the gentleman would start to disappear and the monster would start to come out more. Um, and I didn't know what to say half the time. I didn't know what to do. I was always on my tiptoes trying to figure out what's the right thing to say that won't make him blow up, that won't make him give me the silent treatment for days. But meeting his friends for me was nice, but at the same time, it was very stressful, very frustrating because I could never do anything right. And I could never say the right thing. I could never be myself around these people. So when I would say something about his friends to him, he'd be like, "Oh, they're my friends. Don't worry about it. I'll let them know everything. Don't worry about it." And I'm just like, "Okay, I thought you wanted them to be our friends." I was like, "Okay, they're your friends. I'm not getting in the middle of this." But then the two girls, Jessie and Claire, wanted my number so that we could talk and maybe have girls' night, that kind of thing. And I thought it was nice that I would actually have some friends that I could actually talk to. But he didn't really want me to go out with them without him, which I would find that out later as well. But he did give them my number eventually, and we did start talking and communicating and trying to make plans to go out and things like that. But whenever we did make a plan to go out, something would come up, like on our end, like miraculously something would come up that could have been avoided, but for some reason he just made it, more urgent that it needed to be this. And I'm just like, okay, am I never going to hang out with them? Am I never going to be friends with them? So that was the kind of thing I was dealing with him and his friends in the first beginning part here for I would say maybe the first 6 months to a year. Then after that, it would get better. I would be able to, actually go out with them, we would be able to do things and stuff, and he would not be in the middle of it. But for this episode, the meeting of the friends was something that had to be done, but was not something that I enjoyed at the time. I mean, I did like meeting them. I did like, trying to talk to them, but of course, getting cut off was very frustrating. But, eventually it would lead to friendships that would develop into real friendships for me. And even though I would say the wrong thing sometimes, I would step on the wrong eggshell at the time, I still had friends that I could talk to eventually, which helped out a little. So everything that I went through with meeting the family, meeting the friends, seeing how he was around them, how he boasted about everything he was, everything he had, everything he had manifested for him and us. Because at this point, it was always a we and an us. And it felt good, but as you're going to see later on, that we and us is going to turn into something totally different. But for now, let's just say that meeting the friends was interesting, was a battlefield at times, but yeah, that was something that I did not expect, and I hated being thrown off guard all the time. But I met his friends, I met his family, I made it through, and we will continue to discuss issues with narcissistic exes in this podcast. So I hope that you will continue to watch, that you will like, you will subscribe, you will comment, you will share. Bye for now.